The tea made her cry. Hands trembling, spoon clattering to saucer, a choked breath, tears mixing with steam. PG tips in a chipped mug, stamped with a faded Union Jack, warmed her palms. Earlier, a parcel of fish and chips had steamed through Manchester Guardian newsprint, now sugar and milk in ritual. Mud under her nails, cold rations, bombing sirens, smoke and hunger pressed behind her like a remembered weight. Tea, hot, sweet, impossible. Why is she crying over tea? The parcel was warm. Erica Hartman held it in both hands, staring at the grease already spreading through the newspaper. 42 women stood in line behind her, bodies bent against the September drizzle, breath misting in the damp Windermere air. The WAF corporal who'd handed it to her had moved on, offering the same warm bundles to Greta Cole, to Anna Fisher, to women whose names Erica barely remembered anymore. The newspaper crinkled. The Manchester Guardian. Churchill's face scowled up at her from the front page, his jowls distorted where the grease had already begun to soak through. Ink transferred to Erica's fingertips, black smudges across the whorls of her thumbs. Behind her, Greta whispered in German, "They're feeding us out of rubbish." Erica's hands trembled. She unwrapped the paper slowly, peeling back the newsprint layer by layer. Churchill's face tore in half. Beneath it, something golden, something that steamed in the cold air. Fish, white and flaking, chips, thick-cut and glistening. A wedge of lemon rolled onto her palm. "Newspaper," Greta hissed, "like we're animals." But the smell, salt and vinegar and hot fat cutting through the rain-soaked September afternoon. Erica's stomach folded in on itself. She hadn't eaten anything hot in 3 days. Nothing real in longer than that. She lifted the fish to her mouth. The batter cracked between her teeth. The flesh underneath was tender, almost sweet, falling apart on her tongue. Grease coated her lips. She took another bite, faster this time, tearing into it with her teeth, and the salt hit the back of her throat like a fist. Around her, the other women had stopped whispering. Anna Fisher stood frozen, holding her parcel unopened. Greta had peeled hers back and was staring at the chips as if they might explode. Down the line, Margot Brenner, 19 years old, former BDM youth leader, had already started eating, tears streaming down her face as she shoved fried potatoes into her mouth with blackened fingers. Erica devoured the fish. Grease ran down her wrist, soaking into the sleeve of her Wehrmacht issue jacket. The vinegar stung her chapped lips. She didn't care. She licked her fingers, tasting ink and salt and something she couldn't name, something that felt like being human again. Across the courtyard, the WAF corporal stood watching. She was maybe 30, with a severe face and hair pinned back in regulation style. In her hands, a chipped mug with a faded Union Jack printed on the side. She raised it to her lips, took a slow sip of tea and said nothing. Erica looked down at her hands. Black with newsprint, shining with fish oil, shaking. She picked up the lemon wedge and bit into it, rind and all. The chip burned her tongue, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Each one was thick and soft inside, crispy outside, dusted with coarse salt that dissolved on contact. She ate with both hands, cramming them into her mouth, grease running between her knuckles. Beside her, Greta had started eating too, quietly, methodically, her face blank. The newspaper lay crumpled at Erica's feet, Churchill's face pressed into the gravel. Rain began to fall harder, drumming on the tin roof of the processing shed, the sound mixed with something else, a wet, choking noise. Ilse Brandt was crying into her chips. The older woman stood 3 places down the line, bent over her parcel, shoulders shaking as she ate. No sound except the small, desperate gasps between bites. Her fingers were black. Her face was wet. She ate anyway. Erica looked away. The WAF corporal finished her tea, set the mug down on a wooden crate, pulled out a pack of Players' cigarettes, and lit one with a match that flared bright in the grey afternoon. She smoked and watched them eat, her expression never changing. Erica's parcel was empty, just newsprint and grease stains and the ghost of vinegar. She folded the paper carefully, Churchill's torn face pressed against an advertisement for Pear's soap, and held it in her lap. Her stomach hurt, not from hunger, from the sudden, overwhelming presence of food. "Form up," the corporal said. Her voice carried across the courtyard, clipped and efficient. "Single file, follow Sergeant Willis to barracks assignment." The women moved slowly. Greta dropped her newspaper, and it blew away across the gravel, tumbling past the fence line. Margot wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing grease and tears together. Ilse stood very still, staring at her empty hands. Erica got in line. The rain came down harder. The smell of fried fish lingered in the air, mixing with wet wool and cigarette smoke and the sharp, clean scent of British soap from the barracks ahead. She looked at her hands one more time. The newsprint had stained them completely, black across her palms, dark crescents under her nails. She raised them to her face and breathed in. Salt, grease, ink, England. Behind them, the WAF corporal crushed her cigarette under her boot and picked up the empty mug. She walked back toward the mess building without looking at the line of German women shuffling through the rain. Erica's hands were still shaking, but her stomach was full. That night, lying on a thin mattress in a Nissen hut that smelled of disinfectant and damp metal, Erica pressed her blackened fingers against her lips. The taste of salt was still there, faint but real. Across the room, someone was crying. Quiet, rhythmic sobs that matched the sound of rain on the curved tin roof. Erica closed her eyes, saw Churchill's face tearing in half, felt the heat of the fish against her palms, tasted vinegar and shame and something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. In the darkness, Greta's voice. "Tomorrow, they'll make us work." No one answered. Erica touched her tongue to her fingertips. Still black, still shaking, still warm. The morning shift bell clanged against tin walls at 6:30. Erica's hands still smelled like yesterday's fish. She stood in the quartermaster's line with 20 others, breath fogging in the October cold. Mrs. Davison sat behind a battered desk covered in stamped forms and metal cash boxes. A thermos of tea steamed beside her left elbow. On the wall behind her, a Ministry of Food poster showed a cheerful housewife holding a ration book like scripture. Margot shuffled forward, clutching her camp identification card. Her knuckles were white. Mrs. Davison looked up. Mid-50s, steel-grey hair pinned tight, reading glasses on a chain. She took Margot's card, stamped a form twice, then slid a small booklet across the desk. "National Registration Ration Book," she said. "Valid through January. 2 ounces Cadbury per week. 4 ounces butter substitute. Tea allowance same as civilians." Margot stared at the booklet. Tan cover. Official stamps. Her name typed in English across the top line. "This is mine?" "That's right, love. But Margot's voice cracked. "You won the war." Mrs. Davison removed her glasses, folded them carefully. When she spoke, her tone hadn't changed at all. "Ministry says everyone over 16 gets the same. German, British, don't matter to the coupons." She pulled her own ration book from her coat pocket, creased at the corners, tea-stained, opened it to show the identical stamps, the identical allowances typed in the same government font. "See? My daughter in Sheffield gets this, my sister in Cardiff gets this, and now you get this." She tapped Margot's book once. "We're all eating the same bloody toast, aren't we?" Margot took the book with trembling fingers, turned to the first page. Cadbury chocolate, 2 Oz weekly. The stamp beside it looked realer than anything she'd been taught. She walked back to the barracks in silence, past the laundry lines and the vegetable garden the British women had planted in September. Greta was scrubbing her hands at the outdoor pump. What did they give you? Margot held up the ration book. Greta stopped pumping, stared, then laughed once, sharp and bitter. They're madder than we thought. That afternoon, during work detail in the camp laundry, Margot ironed British Army tunics beside a waif named Doris. The girl couldn't have been older than 20. She hummed while she worked, pressing collars with efficient movements, a rhythm Margot found herself matching without thinking. "You get your rations yet?" Doris asked, not looking up. Margot nodded. "Cadbury's not bad. I save mine for POWs. Sundays." Doris flipped a tunic, steam rising. "Mum sends me letters asking if I've eaten mine yet, like I'm still 10. Margot pressed an iron over damp wool. The heat felt good on her cold hands. "In Germany, they told us Britain was starving." Doris snorted. "Oh, we are. Just slowly, and with proper manners." She pulled a small bar of dairy milk from her apron pocket, broke it in half, offered Margot a piece without ceremony. "Go on. Won't tell if you won't." Margot took it. The chocolate sat heavy in her palm, foil crinkling. They ate in silence, irons hissing, steam clouding the narrow laundry room. The sweetness coated Margot's tongue. Real sugar, real cocoa. She could taste the ration system working exactly as intended. Everyone just a little bit hungry, everyone just a little bit equal. When the work shift ended at 5, Margot returned to the barracks. Ilse sat on her bunk, mending a torn camp-issue skirt with thread she'd pulled from a potato sack. Anna Fisher was reading a months-old copy of Picture Post someone had left behind. Erica lay on her cot, staring at the curved metal ceiling. Margot climbed onto her bunk and unwrapped her ration bar in the dimming light. The foil crackled loud enough that Ilse looked up. "You're really going to eat that?" "Mrs. Davison said it's the same as hers." "Mrs. Davison's a liar." But Margot bit into it anyway. The chocolate melted immediately, rich and dark and impossibly sweet. She took another bite, then another. Her stomach clenched. The sweetness turned metallic. She could taste the lie she'd carried across every kilometer from Berlin to this camp, the story that Britain was broken, beaten, begging. She swung off the bunk and stumbled outside into the cold. Behind the barracks, past the coal shed, she fell to her knees in the dirt and vomited into a thorny bush that smelled like rotting leaves. The chocolate came up bitter. Her throat burned. She heaved again, tears streaming, her whole body shaking. When it was over, she stayed there on her hands and knees, breathing hard, the taste of Cadbury and stomach acid mixing in her mouth. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Greta appeared, holding a tin cup of water. "Finish it?" Margot nodded. Greta handed her the cup. Margot rinsed and spat, then drank the rest in shaking gulps. "They gave us their rations," Margot whispered. "Exactly their rations." "I know. Why?" Greta looked back toward the barracks, toward the lights coming on in the British quarters across the yard, toward the flagpole where the Union Jack hung limp in the still evening air. "Because they won," she said quietly, "and they can afford to be kind." She walked back inside. Margot stayed in the dirt, cup empty in her lap, the taste of vomit and chocolate still sharp on her tongue. Somewhere a door slammed. A radio crackled to life, BBC voices drifting across the camp. The dinner bell would ring soon. She stood slowly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The ration book was still in her pocket, sharp-edged against her hip. She touched it once, then walked back to the barracks as the first stars appeared over Windermere. Inside, Ilse was lighting the small stove. Erica was brushing her hair. Anna had fallen asleep with the magazine open on her chest. Margot climbed back onto her bunk and lay down, the springs creaking under her weight. Her mouth still tasted like chocolate. The afternoon sun cut through the mess hall windows like an accusation. Dust floated in the light. Mismatched teacups lined the tables. porcelain rescued from bombed-out homes in Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, chipped rims, faded roses, no two patterns matched. Major Phyllis Heaton stood at the door watching her experiment unfold. 40 women, half British, half German. One room, one ritual. Ilse Brandt sat rigid across from Corporal Jean McKinnon. Her hands were fists on the scarred wood. Around them, nervous silence thickened like the steam rising from the kettle on the serving table. "This is humiliation theatre," Ilse said in German, her voice flat. She stared at the empty cup in front of her, like it might contain poison. Jean McKinnon said nothing. She reached for the brown Betty teapot, heavy, institutional, the spout chipped, and poured. The tea was dark, almost black. She added milk from a small jug. The liquid turned the color of wet sand. Then the sugar, 2 cubes from the Tate and Lyle tin. She dropped them in with deliberate precision. Clink, clink. The spoon stirred 3 times, clockwise. The sugar dissolved with a faint hiss. Jean pushed the cup across the table. The porcelain scraped against wood. Ilse didn't move. At the next table, Erica watched a waif named Patricia demonstrate the proper way to hold a teacup. Pinky down, not up. "That's common," Patricia said, smiling. "My mum would have my head." Greta sat beside Margot, arms crossed, refusing to touch anything. "They're making us perform civilization," she muttered, "like trained animals." But Margot had already picked up her cup. The warmth spread through the porcelain into her palms. She drank. The sweetness hit first, then the bitter undertone of rationed tea, then the milk smoothing everything into something almost kind. "It's good," she whispered, shocked by her own voice. Across from her, Waif Corporal Doris grinned and took a scone from the plate between them. "It's rubbish tea, love. Wartime rations. But it's hot and it's ours." Ours. The word hung in the air like smoke. Back at Ilse's table, Jean McKinnon spread margarine on a scone. Not butter. There was no butter. The margarine was pale yellow, almost grey. She bit into it with a small, precise crunch. "My brother drowned off the coast of France," Jean said quietly, chewing. Her Scottish accent turned the words into something hard and smooth, like stones in a river. "Dunkirk. They pulled him out 3 days later. Fish had been at him." She took another bite, swallowed, looked directly at Ilse. "But you'll drink your tea proper. That's how we do things." Ilse's hands unclenched. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the cup. The porcelain was warm, almost hot. The steam carried the smell of sugar and something floral she couldn't name. She lifted it, held it at her lips. The heat touched her mouth first, then she drank. The sweetness was shocking, violent almost. She'd forgotten sugar could taste like this, like childhood, like Christmas, like something other than deprivation and ash. The tea was bitter underneath, but the milk gentled it, and the sugar made it bearable. She drank again, deeper. The cup tilted higher. She emptied it in 4 long swallows. When she set it down, her hand was shaking so hard, the porcelain rattled against the saucer. Jean refilled it without asking. Same process. Milk, 2 sugars, 3 stirs. Again, Jean said. Not a request, a command wrapped in courtesy. Ilse drank, this time slower. She tasted it, the tannins, the faint metallic edge of rationed leaves, the sweetness clinging to the roof of her mouth. Across the room, Anna Fisher sat beside a quiet ATS volunteer named Margaret. They hadn't spoken, but Margaret had placed a scone on Anna's plate and pushed the margarine toward her. Anna stared at it for a full minute before picking it up. The margarine was soft. It smeared unevenly. She bit down. The taste was nothing, bland, wartime. But it was warm, and Margaret had given it to her. Anna's eyes filled. She didn't cry, but her throat worked as she swallowed. At the head table, Major Heaton sipped her own tea and watched. She'd served in the First War. She knew what happened when women were denied small dignities. She also knew what happened when enemies shared sugar. Ilse's second cup was empty. She set it down carefully. Her hands had stopped shaking. She looked at John McKinnon, really looked at her. A woman her own age, brown hair pinned beneath a cap, a faint scar above her left eyebrow, tired eyes. Ilse reached for the sugar bowl. Her fingers closed around a single cube. She lifted it, held it for a moment, then placed it deliberately on Jean's saucer. Jean's expression didn't change, but she nodded once. A fractional dip of the chin. She picked up the cube, dropped it into her own cup, stirred once. Drank. The room was full of small sounds now, spoons clinking, cups being refilled, quiet murmurs in English and German. Somewhere near the back, a woman laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound that cut off almost immediately, as if she'd forgotten she was allowed. Margot finished her tea and reached for the pot. Doris pushed it toward her. "Go on then, pour your own." Margot's hands were steadier now. She poured, added milk, 1 sugar cube, stirred. The ritual felt ancient, important, like something passed down through generations of women who survived by making warmth out of leaves and water. She drank. And this time, she didn't vomit. Across the table, Doris bit into a scone and spoke through crumbs. "Your English is getting better, you know." Margot blinked. "I practice. At night. Keep at it. You'll sound proper posh by Christmas." Christmas. The word landed like a stone. Would they still be here at Christmas? Would there be another afternoon social hour? Would Doris pour her tea again? Ilse stared at the empty space between her cup and Jean's. The steam was fading, the porcelain cooling, but something had shifted. Some invisible border had been crossed, not with flags or declarations, but with sugar cubes and silence. Jean stood. She collected the teapot, the milk jug, the sugar tin. She paused beside Ilse's chair. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Bring your cup." Then she was gone, boots clicking on the wooden floor, the smell of tea lingering behind her. Ilse sat alone. Her fingers traced the rim of the chipped teacup. Her reflection wavered in the dregs at the bottom, distorted, barely recognizable, but still there. The recreation hut smelled like damp wood and boot polish. December rain hammered the corrugated roof in waves, drowning out the voices of women mending socks under dim bulbs. Corporal Eleanor Finch carried the wireless set like it was made of glass. The Bush Diac 90A, battered olive-green casing scraped white at the corners, had survived 3 bombing raids in Liverpool. She set it on the windowsill, unwound the frayed cord, and plugged it into the single outlet by the door. Static filled the room, then a whistle. Then voices speaking rapid-fire English that made Margot's head hurt. Eleanor turned the dial slowly. More static. A fragment of classical music. Then the horns hit first. Glenn Miller's "In the Mood" exploded into the hut like a physical force. Brassy, swinging, relentless, every German woman froze. Erika's hands stopped mid-stitch. Greta's mouth opened. Ilse, sitting in the corner with her arms wrapped tight around her knees, went rigid. They'd been taught this music was rot. American degeneracy. Jewish corruption designed to weaken the Aryan soul. The rhythm was dangerous. The joy was false. Even humming it could get you reported. But the sound, the horns climbing and falling, the drums driving forward like something alive. Eleanor started snapping her fingers. Her shoulders swayed. Her foot tapped. She grinned at the ceiling, eyes closed, moving like the music was something she'd been starving for. "Christ, I missed this," she said to no one. Anna Fisher dropped the picture post she'd been reading. Her eyes stayed locked on Eleanor's moving body, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. The saxophone solo kicked in. Eleanor spun in place, laughing, and grabbed the nearest hand. Margot's. "Come on, love," Eleanor said, pulling her up from the bench. "It's just a dance." Margot tried to pull away. Her feet wouldn't move properly. Her body had forgotten how to do anything that wasn't labor or stillness. But Eleanor didn't let go. She placed Margot's hand on her shoulder, took her waist, and started moving. 1 step, 2, a spin that made Margot's skirt flare. Margot's hips began to sway. She didn't choose it. The rhythm pulled it out of her like water from a well. Her feet remembered something her brain had locked away. Eleanor spun her again, and suddenly Margot was laughing, a shocked, gasping sound she hadn't heard from her own throat in months. Across the room, Waff Corporal Doris grabbed Greta's hand. Greta jerked back. "I don't—" "You do now," Doris said, and pulled. The room began to move. British women hauling German women to their feet, hands clasped, bodies swaying, the floorboards creaking under the stomp of boots, keeping time. Someone clapped. Someone else whistled. The music swelled and the hut became a single breathing thing made of motion and sound. Ilse sat in the corner, arms still crossed. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes were wet. She watched Eleanor spin Margot past the wireless, watched Anna tentatively step-touch-step with a laughing ATS volunteer, watched Erica clap along from her seat with a smile breaking across her exhausted face. Ilse's right foot began to tap. She didn't notice at first. The boot moved on its own, keeping time with the snare drum, the bass line, the irresistible forward drive of the brass section. Her shoulders loosened. Her head nodded. The tears came faster. She didn't wipe them. She sat there, arms crossed over her chest like armor, swaying in place as Glenn Miller tore through every lie she'd ever swallowed about what joy was allowed to sound like. The song built. Horns climbed, drums pounded, women spun and stomped and laughed and cried and moved like the war had finally let them go. Then the music stopped. The room went silent except for panting breath and the rain. The BBC announcer's voice crackled through. "That was for all the lads and lasses keeping the peace tonight. God save the King." No one moved. Erica, still seated, her hands resting on her knees, whispered it. "God save the King." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, soft, automatic, like something her body had learned without asking permission. Eleanor heard. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and turned the dial again. Vera Lynn's voice poured out, clear and aching. "We'll meet again. Don't know where. Don't know when." Jean McKinnon appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from her cap. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching the German women sway to a British song about hope they weren't supposed to feel. Margot stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, her hand still warm from Eleanor's grip. She looked at Ilse. Ilse looked back. Her boot was still tapping. Margot crossed the room and sat beside her. Didn't say a word, just sat close enough that their shoulders touched. Vera Lynn sang about sunny days and bluebirds and the promise of meeting again. Ilse uncrossed her arms. She reached out and took Margot's hand. They sat like that, two women who'd been taught to hate this music, this language, this enemy, sat holding hands while Vera Lynn's voice filled the hut and the rain drummed the roof and British women watched in silence. When the song ended, Eleanor turned off the wireless. The room stayed quiet. Then Greta stood, brushed off her skirt, looked at Doris. "Same time Thursday?" Greta asked in halting English. Doris grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." One by one, the women filed out into the December rain. Margot helped Ilse to her feet. Ilse's face was blotchy, streaked with tears, but her breathing had steadied. Erica lingered by the windowsill, running her fingers over the wireless casing. Eleanor watched her. "You can stay," Eleanor said. "Listen a bit longer if you want." Erica shook her head, but she didn't move. Eleanor turned the dial one more time. Piano, soft and slow, a voice singing in English. Erica barely understood. She stood there, one hand on the wireless, rain streaking the window beside her, and let the music wash over her like something she'd been dying of thirst for. Eleanor left her there. When Erica finally returned to the barracks, Margot and Ilse were already asleep. Greta sat on her bunk, staring at her hands. "You stayed," Greta said. Erica nodded. "Was it worth it?" Erica climbed into her cot, pulled the wool blanket to her chin. "Yes." Outside, the rain softened. Somewhere in the camp, a guard hummed "In the Mood" on patrol, the melody carrying through the wet December night. The notice appeared on Tuesday morning. Rain streaked down the glass pane over the typed words, "Repatriation Schedule, Soviet Zone of Occupation, March 18th, 1946. Erica read it 3 times before her knees went soft. She walked back to the barracks in silence, gripping the door frame as she entered. Greta looked up from her cot, saw Erica's face and knew. Margot was braiding her hair by the window. Ilse sat mending a torn stocking with thread from Mrs. Davison. "When?" Greta asked. "Next Monday." The thread slipped from Ilse's fingers. The stocking pooled on the floor. Outside, someone was singing along to the BBC. Inside, nobody moved. That night, Erica lay on her cot, burying her face in the coarse wool blanket. It smelled of British soap, carbolic and clean, and the damp that never quite left the Lake District air. She pressed the fabric against her mouth and tried not to think about rubble, about cold, about what happened to women who'd worked for the Wehrmacht when the Soviets came asking questions. She thought instead about fish wrapped in Churchill's face, about Cadbury rationed like mercy, about Jean McKinnon pouring tea with the precision of someone who'd decided kindness was a duty, not a feeling. It didn't help. Major Heaton called them to the mess hall Thursday afternoon. The usual tables had been pushed together into one long line. Mismatched porcelain, tins of Bovril, a pot of weak marmalade, watery sponge cake made with powdered eggs and hope. The British women were already seated. John, Eleanor, Doris, Mrs. Davison in her quartermaster's apron, Patricia with her perfect teacup posture. "Sit," Heaton said. Not an order, an invitation. The German women sat. For a long moment no one spoke. Rain drummed on the tin roof. Somewhere in the camp, a gramophone played Vera Lynn, tinny and distant. Mrs. Davison poured the first cup, passed it to Anna Fisher, who took it with both hands like it might shatter. Eleanor spread margarine on toast and slid it to Greta, who stared at it as if it were a grenade. Jean poured Ilse's tea without asking. 2 sugars, milk, 3 stirs. Ilse took the cup and drank. Then Margot stood. Her chair scraped loud against the floor. Every head turned. She held her chipped teacup in both hands, and her fingers were white around the porcelain. "In Germany," she said, her voice shaking, "they told us you were weak." She looked at Jean, at Mrs. Davison, at Eleanor and Doris and Patricia. "They said you were broken, starving, that you'd beg America for scraps and collapse before winter came." Her cup trembled. Tea sloshed over the rim, burning her thumb. She didn't flinch. "But you gave us your rations." Her voice cracked. "Your sugar, your radio, your songs." She looked down at the tea, at the steam rising between her hands. "You treated us like we were worth a cup of tea." The silence was enormous. Then Jean stood, slowly. Her chair didn't scrape. She moved it back with care, the way she did everything. She lifted her cup, the one with the faded Union Jack stamp on the rim. "To the women," Jean said quietly, "who'll go home and rebuild what men destroyed." Mrs. Davison rose. Then Eleanor. Then Doris, Patricia, every British woman in the room. Then Greta. Then Erica, her hand shaking so hard the tea spilled onto the table. Then Ilse, tears already streaming. And Anna and all the others. 40 women. 40 teacups, lifted in the yellow glow of a single hanging bulb. No cheers. No toasts. Just the soft clink of porcelain touching porcelain, and the sound of women crying into their rations. Erica looked across the table at Patricia, who taught her to hold a teacup properly, and saw her own reflection in the woman's wet eyes. The cups stayed raised. The light flickered once, but held. Monday morning came cold and clear. The women gathered in the courtyard with their small parcels, ration cards, a bar of soap, a tin of Bovril, whatever they'd been allowed to keep. A British army lorry idled by the gate, exhaust curling white in the March air. Jean found Ilse by the barracks steps. She pressed something into Ilse's hand without a word. A small muslin pouch tied with string. Inside, 4 sugar cubes wrapped in a scrap of Manchester Guardian. Ilse stared at it, then at Jean. "For the train," Jean said. Ilse's mouth opened, closed. She nodded once, sharp and fast, and turned away before her face could break. Eleanor caught Margot by the lorry, pulled her into a brief, fierce hug that smelled of cigarettes and Pear's soap. "Write if you can," Eleanor whispered. "Liverpool, Eleanor Finch. They'll find me." Margot nodded into Eleanor's shoulder and didn't let go until the driver honked. Mrs. Davison handed Greta a tin of Cadbury drinking chocolate. "For when you get there," she said, "wherever there is." Greta took it, looked at the tin, looked at Mrs. Davison. "You're all mad," she said. "Likely," Mrs. Davison agreed. Erica was the last to board. She stood at the lorry's tailgate, one foot on the step, and turned back. Major Heaton stood in the doorway of the mess hall, hands behind her back, watching. Erica raised her hand. Not a salute, just a wave. Heaton nodded once. The lorry pulled away. Voiceover, soft, as the lorry disappears down the gravel road. Erica Hartmann returned to Hamburg. She kept the sugar cubes John had given Ilse. Ilse had passed them to her on the train, too sick to eat, wrapped in Manchester Guardian newsprint in a wooden box. She never spoke of the camp. The sugar stayed in the box until she died in 1991, still wrapped, still whole. Margot Brenner refused the Soviet zone. She stayed in Britain, married a Yorkshire miner named Tom, and named her daughter John. She wrote to Eleanor every Christmas until Eleanor passed in 1983. The last letter is in the Imperial War Museum. Ilse Brandt crossed into the Soviet zone and disappeared. In 1953, a letter arrived at Windermere Camp, forwarded through Red Cross channels, postmarked Dresden. Inside, one line in careful English: "I still remember the tea." Jean McKinnon kept it in her Bible until she died. Final shot: a teacup on a wooden table. Steam rising, the faint image of a Union Jack stamp on the rim, worn nearly smooth. The light catches the porcelain. It gleams. Fade to black.